D-Day, 6:51 a.m. The first American invasion force of the Second World War gathered off the coast of Guadalcanal. Over 19,000 young Marines prepared for a mission that many regarded as impossible against the seemingly invincible Japanese.
You had a lot of people that were very silently saying prayers going in, and I'm sure that I was one of them.
The primary mood was a mood of concern and apprehension. I wouldn't describe it as fear, but we had a great respect for their capabilities.
It was 8 months to the day since the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. It marked the beginning of an ocean blitzkrieg across the Pacific. The rapid Japanese advance is driven by brilliant tactics and a willingness to die for their cause.
We had been pretty well orientated on ship about the Japanese philosophy. We knew that essentially the emperor was considered a god. We knew that there'd be very little surrender in that regard because that was considered the ultimate disgrace.
We knew that they were going to be ferocious and that they were going to fight to the death, but we just felt that we were superior. We were United States Marines.
There was so much anger there that if they want to die, you know, for their emperor, we'll accommodate them.
The tropical island of Guadalcanal is 90 miles long and 25 miles wide. Part of the Solomons chain, it was at the furthest limit of the Japanese advance in the South Pacific. On July the 17th, 1942, a single B-17 bomber flew over the island on one of the most important aerial reconnaissance missions of the Pacific War. Photographs taken during this sortie confirmed the worst fears of the US High Command. The Japanese had begun construction of an airfield. Planes based here could attack crucial Allied shipping routes and halt any fightback in the area. The Americans had to take Guadalcanal before the airfield became operational. This photograph reveals that only the northwest corner of the runway remains to be surfaced. Throughout this campaign, aerial photographs were used to provide intelligence on enemy activity. Over 60 years later, these original high-resolution images have been layered over a three-dimensional contour map, creating a unique perspective on the battle below. Stage by stage, the battle for Guadalcanal can be tracked from the air. D-Day, 9 a.m. As the landing force moved closer to shore, the Marines prepared to hit the beaches.
Luckily, the Japanese didn't know we were coming, and we got ashore before a shot was fired.
We didn't run into any opposition on the beach, none whatsoever. And I think that kind of has come as a surprise to us, and we 17 and 18 years old, that probably comes as a disappointment to us. Now, we did run into the opposition later on, and very, very heavily.
After the heavy pre-invasion bombardment, the Japanese defenders had retreated into the jungle. But nearby, it would be a very different story. 20 miles north of Guadalcanal, a specialized landing force was tasked with the capture of a small island group. Their main objective was Tulagi, the location of the Japanese headquarters in the area. It had to be captured and held. The most aggressive and best trained Marines were assigned this dangerous mission.
We heard sporadic firing going from the Higgins boats into the beach. We had no idea how many Japanese troops were ashore.
As the raiders moved inland, they came face to face with an elite enemy force.
We found out later they were Sendai, roughly equivalent to our Marine Corps. They were Naval Special Landing Force troops, and they were quite good.
It was some of the roughest fighting that one can ever imagine. And these were young Americans, some 18, 19 years old, barely out of high school. It was the initiation into the Pacific War, which was a brutal war to the end.
The Marine advance across the 2-mile-long island became a bloody slog as the Japanese mounted a determined defense.
We started taking a lot of fire, and it looked like the fire was going to keep us there for a while. So I told them to hold still, give me some covering fire. I went roaring up there, and there were spurts of dirt all behind me. I got up to a position and hosed down the hillside on the opposite side. I turned to look back to the patrol to wave them forward. They were gone. They'd gone the other direction. I was out there all by myself. Lesson learned there.
For 12 hours, the Japanese Sendai defended from dugouts and tunnels. As night fell, the darkness brought its own horror.
It was pretty frightening because it was an absolutely pitch black night. There was no starlight, no moon. But every now and then there would be a Japanese attack, and they really came at us from every direction. I don't think I was the model of courage right then and there.
Across the water, the impenetrable darkness was equally terrifying for the young recruits on Guadalcanal.
The dominant thing about the end of the first day was the danger of being shot by your own troops. You've got several thousand teenagers ashore. None of them have ever been in combat before. They're all armed. They're all nervous. Every time a coconut fell, there was an eruption of fire.
Everybody on the line is shooting blindly into the jungle. One Marine got hit, so we had one casualty due to our own ineptness.
At the end of the first day, over 10,000 Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal. Their orders for the next day were to advance towards the all-important airfield, capture it, and prepare for a Japanese counterattack. The long struggle to win the Battle of Guadalcanal was about to begin. Guadalcanal, Day 2. The US fightback in the Pacific had begun. Aerial photographs of this tropical island revealed the objective of the American attack. On the northern coast, a tactically vital Japanese airfield was under construction. The US Marines tasked with its capture moved out from their beachhead. They prepared for their first taste of combat with the seemingly invincible Japanese war machine.
They had been touted up in all the press that we've been reading about what wonderful snipers there were and how well they hid and how they surprised everybody all the time. It was a big unknown.
As the Marines slowly advanced westwards, they encountered the first scattered Japanese resistance.
A lot of them were in little foxholes, and when you pass by, they spring up out of them like a trapdoor spider. From that time on, that trigger finger was ready. It was twitching, always twitching.
Marine leaders found navigation near impossible. They were forced to work from hand-drawn maps based on aerial reconnaissance photographs.
And the maps that we used were just line sketches made from that photograph. They showed simply where the beach was, where the rivers were. The map showed us very little about any vertical dimension. We had to learn all of that by examination on the ground after we got there.
Exhausted by the heat, the heavily laden Marines were slow to advance in the thick tropical growth. At 4 p.m., they reached the airfield. To their surprise, the Japanese had withdrawn into the surrounding hills, leaving behind essential fuel, construction materials, and even a few luxuries.
We found a storehouse and we found a lot of rice and sake, rice wine. Oh, that stuff was brutal, but the Marines drank it anyway. The officers banned it after a while. They said, no more of that, you know, you've got to be in fit condition in case we get a big counterattack.
The airstrip was soon christened Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot at the Battle of Midway. Most of the captured Japanese facilities were still intact, including a radio station and a refrigerating plant. The Marines put up a sign, Tojo Ice Factory, under new management. Now they dug in and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. 20 miles north of Guadalcanal, on the small island of Tulagi, the battle was still raging. An elite force of Japanese mounted a fierce defense from a series of caves. To remove them, the Marines used tactics that were crude but deadly.
We would spill gasoline from these 5-gallon jerry cans, and then we'd fire into them to ignite them. We didn't have flamethrowers that early in the war.
We still had World War I equipment, machine guns, rifles, grenades, were all World War I type stuff.
The Marines' lack of modern equipment forced them to use their initiative in the fight to expel the Japanese from their labyrinth of caves.
One cave where there were about 10 of them in there, Angus Gauze was a gunnery sergeant. Angus was trying to get them out of this cave, and I used to fix charges for Angus. And he got up close and threw it in. Before he could get to me, they threw the charge back out. I pulled Angus back. His legs, it was as if his blood vessels had exploded. And he pulled away from me and went charging up, stood on the perimeter of this cave and just hosed it down and killed them all.
Fighting on the islands that surrounded Guadalcanal saw 144 Marines killed with nearly 200 wounded. But by the end of day 2, Tulagi was effectively in Marine hands. On Guadalcanal, a 4-mile-wide defensive perimeter was established around Henderson Field. The key Marine objectives had been secured. Relief spread through the ranks. It would not last long. At 6:42 p.m., Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese fleet in the Solomons, sent a signal to his attack force.
In the finest tradition of the Imperial Navy, we shall engage the enemy in night battle. Every man is expected to do his utmost.
The American fleet, laden with crucial supplies, was stationed just north of Guadalcanal, near Savo Island. Approaching from the west was the Japanese strike force of cruisers and destroyers.
We became aware that there was a ship conflict going off out towards Savo Island. And we watched these flashes, and we watched the ships blow up.
We didn't know at night who was really taking the licking, and because we were cheering, you know, we'd see something blow up and explode, not knowing whether it was ours or theirs.
The next day, we learned that we had lost 4 cruisers.
The Battle of Savo Island was the worst U.S. naval defeat since 1812. The remnants of the American naval force pulled out, taking with them crucial supplies. The forces ashore were left with just 17 days' rations and 4 days' worth of ammunition.
When the transports left, the Marines on shore were just outraged, surprised, confused. These are our fellow Americans and they're abandoning us? We're all alone here on this island? How are we going to get supplies? What about reinforcements? They felt the Navy should have remained in the waters off Guadalcanal and supported them.
Now, without naval support, the Marines were at the mercy of an empire desperate for revenge. The Japanese counterattack was about to begin. Day 3 on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division prepared for a long and bloody fight. Reconnaissance planes photographed the struggle from high above. Now, these images are used to give a unique perspective on the battle which unfolded below. The Marines set up a 4-mile-wide defensive perimeter around Henderson Field airstrip, soon to become the most contested piece of earth in the Pacific theater. In an attempt to dislodge the Marines, Japanese aircraft made incessant raids against the runway.
They had these giant seaplanes that circled all night long. We call them Washing Machine Charlie, and they'd throw out fragmentation bombs, about 25-pounders, you know, all over the place, and you'd hear guys screaming, you know, getting hit.
Marine patrols were sent into enemy territory in expectation of a major counterattack.
Going out on patrol, that is miserable, because in jungle, you can't stay on the same trail every time or you'll be ambushed. The only way you learn that they're there is when the lead guy on the patrol drops with a bullet.
We found some of our boys that we knew, you know, with their heads lopped off, stuffed on a stick along a trail where we would see it. And that just infuriated. It didn't scare anybody, it just infuriated. We'll do them one better. And we did. I tell you, we carved them up.
Some of the fighting on Guadalcanal was so brutal and so primitive, the Marines decided if that's the way the Japanese want it, that's the way we'll give it to them. And for the rest of the war, many of the units just lived by the code, no prisoners taken.
Day 13, 1 a.m. Off Guadalcanal, Japanese destroyers landed a force of over 900 troops led by Colonel Kiyono Ichiki. Before the attack began, the supremely confident enemy leader wrote his diary entry for 2 days in advance.
21st of August, enjoyment of the fruit of victory.
The Japanese advanced west along the coast towards the American defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. At positions behind the Ilu River, the Marines prepared for the attack. At 2 a.m., Colonel Ichiki sent in his elite troops straight at the American machine guns.
They'd plunge into the river, you know, come across. But we had those 37 millimeters set up there, along with 50 caliber air-cooled machine guns.
The attack was relentless, but the Marines were determined to hold the line.
We had a guy from Philadelphia, Schmidt. He got a hit nearby and it blinded him completely. Even though he was blind, he managed to load that gun himself and keep firing. The thing with the air-cooled machine gun, you have to change the barrel after so much firing. When it gets hot, and you're supposed to have asbestos gloves doing it. He couldn't find his. He did it with his bare hands, burned his hands up. And he did all that and kept that gun firing all night long.
Ichiki continued to send in wave after wave of his men.
They're coming in shouting, you know, and hurling obscenities and everything at us, and we just mowed them down. The rivers ran red with blood.
The Marines held their positions through the night. The following morning, M3 Stuart tanks were brought into the attack, and 37mm cannons opened up on the Japanese.
And it was supposed to be used for anti-tank, but we used the canister ammunition, depressed the barrels, and bingo. Each one of those shot was like a buckshot in a shotgun. It was spread out and just mow down everything. Whether it was a human or whether it was undergrowth, it mowed it all down.
By dusk, nearly 800 Japanese were dead at the cost of 34 Americans.
I wondered what kind of a command structure would send 1,000 soldiers, no matter how good they were, against a division of Marines. And my own opinion was that if their generals weren't any better than that, we were in pretty good shape.
In disgrace, the Japanese leader, Colonel Ichiki, committed suicide. The victory changed Marine attitudes.
There had been the myth of the Japanese Superman, that the Japanese were somehow better trained and with superior fighting forces. And this proved that no, it didn't exist, that if the Marines did what Marines do, they would be more than a match for the Japanese opponent.
Despite their defeat, the Japanese continued to land thousands of troops on the island. The Marines were desperate to stop this flow of reinforcements and needed air support. For nearly 2 weeks, they worked around the clock to complete the Henderson Field runway using captured Japanese machinery. By the end of August, American Douglas dive bombers and Wildcat fighters operated out of Henderson Field. Piloted by Marine aviators, they were nicknamed the Cactus Air Force.
We felt sorry for the Marines on the ground because they were having a rough time down there. We knew that every ship that we could keep from coming into Guadalcanal to resupply their forces would help our forces that much.
Japanese convoys, known as the Tokyo Express, raced along the island's treacherous coast in the fight to resupply their own troops. During daylight hours, the Cactus Air Force made Japanese reinforcement a high-risk venture. Due to heavy naval losses on both sides, the seas around Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottoms Sound. Resupplying the Marines still struggling to survive on Guadalcanal was near impossible.
We stayed abandoned for over a month and sort of lived off the land, and there wasn't a lot to live off.
We just didn't have any food for quite a while. At most, we had 1/3 ration, which would be 1 can for you for a day. We were really starving out there.
5 weeks into the campaign, Japanese forces amassed for their largest counterattack to date. Marines hurriedly reinforced a weak point in their perimeter on high ground to the south of Henderson Field. If this ridge were to be captured, then nothing would stand between the Japanese and the all-important airstrip. The scene was set for the most dramatic battle in the struggle for Guadalcanal. September the 12th, 1942. The battle for Guadalcanal had raged for 37 days. Aerial reconnaissance images give a unique perspective on this bloody campaign. In the north of the island, United States Marines had established a 4-mile defensive ring around Henderson Field airstrip. Just a mile south of this all-important runway is a 1,000-yard stretch of high ground. It would soon earn the name Bloody Ridge.
The Americans had to hold Bloody Ridge if they wanted to hold Henderson Field. Once you've lost Henderson Field, then you've pretty much lost Guadalcanal.
At this crucial point in the American defenses, over 800 Marines prepared for battle under the leadership of Colonel Merritt Edson.
Edson, who had an exceptional tactical brain, spotted what he thought was the weakest point and the most likely point of attack.
If this ridge fell, then the Japanese would have a clear path through to the airstrip. At 10:30 p.m., a tide of Japanese advanced towards the Marine positions. Flares marked the beginning of the charge.
They would come across in quite a large wave, extending right across this little valley.
Edson called in an artillery barrage just in front of the American lines.
It was barely clearing us and landing down in this valley.
Edson kept bringing the artillery in closer and closer, and the artillery forward observer said, "Sir, this is as far as I can bring it," and Edson ordered it down another 25 yards, some of which fell on our troops, but most of which fell on the Japanese troops.
2 a.m. Japanese mortar shells cut the Marines' communications line. Without artillery support, they were forced back onto an outcrop where Edson would make his last stand.
The Marine skirmish line gave you so much confidence because you knew that your guy on your left and the guy on your right would die to save your life, and you would do the same to them.
As the Japanese threatened to overrun the ridge, the battle descended into bloody hand-to-hand combat.
One got very close. Billy Carey jumped up and swung a rifle like a baseball bat, leveled him. The Japanese were in amongst us, and despite their reputation as great hand-to-hand and judo and everything, they were no match for us.
The Marines held the line, despite mounting casualties.
I saw the grenade that got me. It came up, landed, and I took 2 big chunks in the shoulder, a couple chunks in the butt, and 2 big chunks down in my leg. But I had a Japanese body laying across in front of me, and I just sort of leveled the rifle on top of him and was firing from that position.
Despite fighting a force over 3 times their size, Edson's men stood firm until daybreak. Against all the odds, Bloody Ridge was held.
That ridge did leave a lasting impression on an awful lot of us. And it made us realize just how fortunate we were to have prevailed in that thing. It created an area of pride that I don't think ever goes away with any of us.
After the battle, aerial photographs show the area surrounding the ridge potted with shell holes. Evidence of a battle that would go down in history.
Bloody Ridge was a battle of who's going to outlast the other guy, who's going to be standing after the last punch is thrown. And the Marines certainly had that spirit of we're not going to give up.
Guadalcanal became a battle of attrition. The Marines fought not just the Japanese, but the island itself. For every man who was a combat casualty, 5 fell to malaria.
The malaria just sort of crept in on us, and when you came down, you were down. There wasn't much you could do.
You had bouts of just uncontrollable shaking and chills and fever. Wasn't a healthy thing.
Dysentery. I don't think anybody in the company had a solid bowel movement and all the time we were in Guadalcanal.
Day 68, 6:30 p.m. After Bloody Ridge, the Japanese employed new tactics. They tried to smash the Americans off the island with their heaviest bombardment yet. On land, their newly arrived long-range artillery zeroed in on Henderson Field. Offshore, their battleships pounded this strategically vital target with nearly 1,000 shells.
And when they'd fire a salvo in, it was like an earthquake. The earth would heave up, you know, when all those shells hit at once.
It was absolutely terrifying because you never knew which one was going to hit you or not. And one big one landed right in our camp.
By the following afternoon, Henderson Field was completely out of action. These aerial photographs show the field littered with destroyed planes. Day 76. The Japanese launched an elaborate multi-pronged offensive against Henderson Field. But the attack descended into chaos after a breakdown in communication between its commanders in the dense jungle. The uncoordinated assault was repelled by the Marines.
After the battle, they asked the prisoner, well, why didn't you modify your attack? It obviously wasn't working. And he said, well, we were given orders to attack that point, and we were not going to question those orders. So that was that Japanese inflexibility. The Marines would have the improvisation. The Japanese inflexibility would cause them to keep repeating an attack even if it wasn't working.
The Japanese were tremendously brave, courageous to the point of foolhardiness. They attack machine guns by frontally and charging into them. They lose every time.
The defeated Japanese retreated into the jungle without food or water. The Americans would launch a coordinated land, air, and sea offensive to end the battle for Guadalcanal once and for all. Day 87. It was nearly 3 months since the US Marines had invaded the Pacific island of Guadalcanal. Since then, the Americans had inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the Japanese. Now, they were poised to push enemy artillery out of range of Henderson Field and annihilate what remained of Japanese forces on the island. To the west of the Matanikau River, long-range patrols expected ambushes at any time.
Our watchword then was, death is only 5 feet away. And it was. Somebody could hide just a few steps away from you.
Because of Japanese losses in previous battles, many replacement troops were not combat-proven.
My squad, we ran into a bunch of Japanese who were not organized. I mean, they were apparently green, new troops. I was in the head of my squad. And there in front of me were 3 Japanese soldiers, and we slaughtered them. In a few seconds there, I killed 3 Japanese who were almost defenseless. But that didn't last long.
As the patrol advanced, it came under fire from a hidden sniper.
Suddenly, a bullet hit the rock near where I was and looked around. I couldn't see anything. Another one went right by my ear. I took a shot at him and missed. Suddenly discovered rifle was out of ammunition. I had to get a clip. I'm sure it was the world's record, getting a clip out of that belt. I got him through the head, and his rifle went up in the air, and he fell off to the left.
Yard by yard, the Marines cleared the Japanese from the Matanikau area. It marked the beginning of a slow advance across the island. Day 99. Despite the campaign going against them, the Japanese High Command tried one last desperate counterattack. A Japanese task force was launched. Their orders were to neutralize the Guadalcanal airfields. Once they had been put out of operation, the Japanese could safely land troops from their convoys' transports. In the darkness, an American cruiser force was attacked by the advancing Japanese.
We were cruising right off from Guadalcanal. We got right in between two battle columns. 13,000 yards, point-blank range. Now this is night battle, so you don't know who enemy is and who is friendly.
A salvo of shells bombarded the American ships.
We got hit with 7 14-inch shells through the bridge. First Lieutenant Joe Hubbard was walking past gun 6, and a piece of the shield took his head right off the shoulders. It just rolled down the deck and he was gone.
Of the 13 American ships, 12 were either sunk or damaged. But during the battle, the Japanese also suffered heavy losses.
Here come a Japanese destroyer down our port side, and gun 8 opened fire and put a 5-inch shell right into their depth charges. And we could hear the screaming from the Japanese sailors, and the ship was sizzling when it went under.
The Japanese were forced to retreat. Not one enemy shell landed on Henderson Field. 10:12 a.m. With their screening force in withdrawal, the Japanese troop transports were unprotected. As they attempted to reinforce Guadalcanal, the transports were caught in the firing line of the Cactus Air Force.
Those things were absolutely loaded with people. I never saw anything like it. As we would come in and get down there around 1,000 feet or so, all we could see is humanity all over the decks. It was sinful to see that many people on there as you were going in to hit them.
This aerial photograph shows the American attack in progress. The fully laden transports were destroyed. Only 2,000 soldiers made it onto the island alive. By the end of November, the Japanese no longer controlled the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. Supplies to the trapped enemy troops dwindled. The island they once defended became their graveyard.
Most of the Japanese who went to Guadalcanal died on Guadalcanal. If they didn't die from malaria, they died at the hands of American Marines or starvation. It came down to where some Japanese were forced to try and eat part of their own uniforms to get some nourishment out of that. And so the Japanese have always referred to it as the Isle of Death because so few of them returned from it.
December the 7th, 1942. Exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, Marine Commander General Alexander Vandegrift sent a message to his men. Your unbelievable achievement has made Guadalcanal a synonym for death and disaster in the enemy. The Marines, many of them boys no older than 20, had held the island through courage, sacrifice, and sheer bloody will.
The spirit was everything, and they called it the gung-ho spirit. We learned you can't show any fear, never take a backward step, because it just encourages them. The harder they fight, the harder you lay it on.
The people that won the battle, the war out there, were the ground people. It wasn't we pilots. It was the ground people that won it. They had the dirty job and they did it. And they were, you know, heroes on top of heroes out there.
The Marines' mission was accomplished. They had taken and held Guadalcanal. Army forces were given the task of clearing the remaining Japanese off the island. After 4 months of horrific fighting, the Marines began to disembark from their island hell.
I was lying on the beach, shaking all over with malaria, just down to skin and bones, and they sent the Higgins boats in to pick us up.
We were pretty beat. Everybody had malaria or dysentery. Many of us still had wounds that were suppurating. We were in pretty sad physical shape. Really not capable of carrying on much longer.
Over 6 months after the invasion began, the complete and total defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal was declared. The campaign had cost the lives of some 7,000 Americans and approximately 30,000 Japanese. It was a decisive victory that would set the tone of combat in the Pacific.
Churchill made the statement that battles can be very important because they change people's perceptions. And I think that's exactly what happened at Guadalcanal. The Japanese perception of themselves was shocked and altered a little bit. Our perception of our capacity to defeat them was changed. And most important, we had stopped their advance and laid the foundation for starting it in the other direction.
This bitter and bloody battle would turn the tide of the Pacific War. From the determined defense of Guadalcanal, the Americans would launch an offensive that would lead all the way to Japan's doorstep and ultimately to victory.